When you begin to understand the nature of attention, you quickly realize that it is one of the most valuable currencies you possess. Where your attention goes, your energy follows. Where your energy flows, your life is shaped. So every time you turn your eyes, your mind, or your heart towards something, you are not just noticing it, you are investing in it. You are strengthening it. And here's the problem: when you give your attention to the negative, to petty insults, to the provocations designed to draw you into conflict, you are empowering precisely the things that weaken you. Think about it. A person throws a cruel remark your way. If you respond in anger, you've immediately handed them victory. You've shown them that their words can disrupt your peace, that they can control your emotional state. The moment you react, you've given them a piece of your strength, and the more you replay that insult in your mind, the more power it gains, until you are carrying around someone else's poison as if it were your own. Complaining about it, venting endlessly to others about it, keeps the wound alive. Your attention has fertilized the seed of bitterness. But ignoring, genuinely refusing to grant it even the smallest corner of your consciousness is a profound act of strength. It is not apathy, it is not cowardice, it is self-mastery. You are declaring in your silence that not every voice deserves to be heard, not every attack deserves a defense, and not every insult deserves the dignity of acknowledgement. You are saying, my focus is too valuable to be wasted on this. This principle becomes even clearer if you observe the dynamics of human interaction. People crave recognition. Whether positive or negative, attention validates them, even if they are wrong, even if they are destructive. It tells them they matter enough to disturb your peace. That's why children sometimes misbehave deliberately. They would rather receive negative attention than be ignored. Adults are not so different. Many attacks, insults, or petty dramas are just attempts to elicit energy from you. And if you engage, you've given them exactly what they wanted. The most effective response then is often no response at all. Ignoring strips away the reward. It denies the manipulator the satisfaction of knowing they've disturbed you. Instead of feeding the fire, you smother it by refusing to supply oxygen. That is why ignoring is not weakness. It is an exercise in dominance, a refusal to be dragged down into the mud of meaningless battles. Now some will argue that ignoring is passive, that it's simply avoiding confrontation. But this misunderstands the depth of what's happening. To ignore effectively requires strength. It requires restraint, discipline, and clarity of mind. Anyone can lash out in anger. Anyone can waste energy proving a point, shouting over noise. That is easy. But to withhold attention, to stand calmly in the storm, and refuse to give it your energy requires a deeper power. It is an act of conscious self-governance. Philosophically, this ties back to the principle that you become what you attend to. If you spend your life focused on grievances, you will become bitter. If you dwell on petty conflicts, you will shrink into pettiness yourself. But if you withhold your attention from the trivial and instead direct it toward responsibility, growth, and higher goals, you elevate yourself. You become more than the insults, more than the provocations, more than the noise. You transcend it. Psychologically, the refusal to respond also shifts the balance of power. The one who reacts is always at the mercy of the instigator. But the one who remains composed, who does not hand over their attention, maintains sovereignty. They show by their silence that they are not controlled by external forces. That's why ignoring is not only classy, it's deeply strategic. It communicates that you are operating from a higher plane, that you cannot be baited into lowering yourself. And this is where the idea of revenge comes in. Not revenge in the sense of cruelty or retaliation, but revenge in the sense of asserting dignity in the face of provocation. The greatest revenge is to show that you remain untouchable, that their attempts to provoke you fail, not because you didn't notice, but because you refuse to care. That is the deepest humiliation you can hand back to those who seek to drag you down. The realization that their words, their games, their noise did not matter enough to you to deserve even a single drop of your energy. So the next time you feel that sting of insult, pause, ask yourself, is this really worth my attention? Do I want to grant this person power over my emotions? Or do I want to remain master of myself? If you can choose the second path, if you can ignore with dignity, you will discover a strange, liberating power. Nothing external can control you unless you grant it your focus, And that is what makes ignoring the classiest form of revenge. It requires no words, no theatrics, no wasted energy. It is the silent assertion that your time, your mind, and your strength are too valuable to be squandered on the unworthy. It is a quiet declaration that you are sovereign over yourself. The ultimate revenge, then, is not to strike back, it is to rise above. And you rise above by refusing to bend your attention toward what seeks to weaken you. That is power. That is dignity. That is strength. Silence has always carried a kind of paradoxical weight. On the surface, it appears as nothing, an absence of words, an absence of sound. But in practice, silence often speaks louder than the most carefully chosen arguments. It communicates something fundamental about who you are, about the depth of your character and the steadiness of your spirit. When you choose silence in the face of provocation, you are declaring that you do not need to justify yourself, you do not need to prove yourself, and you do not need to reduce yourself to the level of those trying to pull you into meaningless conflict. The temptation to explain, to defend, or to retaliate is deeply human. When someone criticizes you unfairly or questions your motives, your instinct is to fight back, to set the record straight, to make sure others know the truth of the situation. But here's the problem. In doing so, you often hand over your authority. Explanations can easily slip into excuses, and excuses reveal insecurity. The more you try to defend yourself, the more you signal that you are affected, that you are seeking permission to exist as you are. Silence, on the other hand, says, I don't need your validation. I don't need to argue with you because my life, my actions, and my results already speak for me. For me, it's an act of profound confidence, and this confidence is precisely what makes silence powerful. You are not running from the confrontation, you are rising above it. You are refusing to be pulled into the drama, not because you lack words, but because your dignity demands restraint. There's a deep psychological reality here. Human beings are wired to seek reaction. If I insult you and you respond with anger, I know I've struck a nerve. I know I've gotten inside your head, and if you argue back, the conflict escalates. The more you speak, the more material I have to attack. But if you remain silent, if you refuse to play the game, then I am left powerless. Silence frustrates those who seek to provoke because they feed on attention, and silence starves them. This is why silence is so often misunderstood. To the untrained eye, silence might look like weakness. It might look like you've backed down, but in truth, silence is strength precisely because it requires discipline. Anyone can throw words in the heat of the moment. Anyone can blurt out an angry retort. That's easy, but to withhold words, to stand firm without needing to defend yourself, that requires mastery of the self. It requires you to be so rooted in who you are that no attack can shake you. And notice what silence does for your credibility. People who constantly explain themselves are rarely respected. Their insecurity is written all over their words. But the individual who speaks less, who refuses to waste energy justifying or excusing, is taken more seriously. Their silence creates mystery. It forces others to reflect. It forces others to recognize that this person is not playing the usual social games. And that is attractive. It communicates authority. Think of historical figures who carried immense presence. Many of them were not known for endless speeches or arguments. They were known for restraint, for speaking when necessary and withholding words when silence was more powerful. Their silence commanded attention because it was chosen, not imposed. This principle also has a personal, practical dimension. Silence protects your energy. Words are not free. Every time you engage in an argument, you expend psychological resources. You drain yourself. By choosing silence, you conserve that energy. You keep your strength for what matters most, your goals, your responsibilities, your higher aims. The world is noisy enough as it is. Adding your voice to meaningless arguments only entangles you in chaos. But silence cuts through the noise. It creates clarity. Of course, silence should not be mistaken for passivity. There are times when words are necessary, when standing up and speaking the truth is an obligation. But most of the time, the battles we fight with words are trivial, ego-driven, unnecessary. In those cases, silence is not avoidance. It is strategy. It is the refusal to let pettiness dictate the use of your energy. And here's the final paradox. Silence often says more than words ever could. It communicates strength without boasting, confidence without explanation, calm without indifference. Silence tells the world, I am not shaken. I am not desperate to be understood. I do not need to lower myself to win this argument because I've already won by refusing to play. The world today is addicted to noise. Everyone wants to broadcast, to justify, to explain. But the rare individual who can master silence will always stand apart. They will carry an aura of authority that cannot be faked. They will embody a kind of class, a refinement that retaliation and endless explanations will never achieve. So the next time you are tempted to fire back, to defend yourself endlessly, remember this. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is presence. It is the presence of someone so anchored in themselves that they cannot be moved by trivial storms, hidden in the idea of ignoring as a form of classy revenge. And it becomes fully realized when you bring responsibility into the picture. To ignore someone or something is not merely to withhold attention, it is to redirect that attention toward what actually matters. The act of rising above is not just restraint, it is responsibility. It is the refusal to waste yourself on smallness because you have committed yourself to something greater. When people provoke you, when they attempt to drag you into cycles of bitterness or resentment, the real test is not simply whether you can stay silent, it is whether you can channel that energy into building something meaningful. Ungarms without responsibility becomes emptiness. It risks turning into apathy, even nihilism. But ignoring with responsibility transforms you. It takes the sting of provocation and turns it into fuel for creation, discipline, and growth. This is what makes it truly powerful. Consider this. Every moment you spend reacting is a moment stolen from the pursuit of your higher aims. Every angry word, every defensive explanation is time and energy you will never get back. And what have you gained? Perhaps a small victory in the moment, perhaps the satisfaction of feeling like you won the argument. But in the larger game of life, you lose because you have diverted yourself from the path of becoming who you could be. The higher form of revenge is not to win small battles. It is to transcend them altogether by building a life so solid, so meaningful, that those battles fade into irrelevance. Responsibility becomes the anchor here. What does it mean to take responsibility? It means you accept that your energy is not infinite, and therefore you must be deliberate in how you use it. It means you recognize that life is difficult enough on its own without voluntarily entangling yourself in petty wars of words. And most of all, it means you decide to direct your focus toward the things that expand your character, your work, your family, your health, your higher values. Psychologically, this act of rising above is transformative. You cannot hold on to petty grievances and also carry the heavy weight of responsibility. They are incompatible. One shrinks you into cycles of victimhood, the other stretches you into maturity. And here's the hard truth. Most people choose the former because it's easier. Complaining is easier than building. Retaliating is easier than restraining, but ease is the enemy of strength. Responsibility is difficult, and that difficulty is precisely why it has the power to elevate you. There's a moral dimension here too. When you choose responsibility over retaliation, you are not only strengthening yourself, you are setting an example. You are demonstrating what it looks like to carry yourself with dignity, to refuse to be reduced to bitterness, to turn the energy of resentment into something constructive. In a world full of noise and conflict, that example matters. It shows others, perhaps your children, your colleagues, your friends, that true strength is not found in winning arguments, but in winning the inner war against pettiness. Imagine someone insults you publicly. The easy path is to fire back, to humiliate them in return, and maybe you win that exchange, but what then? You've only deepened the cycle of hostility. But if instead you ignore, and more importantly, you commit yourself to pursuing your responsibilities with even greater focus, building your career, deepening your relationships, improving your health, you create a life that becomes its own response. The insult fades, but your growth remains. And in time, the very people who once mocked you cannot ignore the undeniable weight of your character. There's a great irony here. The most powerful form of revenge is not revenge at all. It is responsibility. By refusing to lower yourself and instead raising your standards for how you live, you outgrow the smallness of those who tried to pull you down. Their words lose power because your life has become the louder statement. Now, none of this is easy. It requires discipline to walk away from meaningless conflict. It requires humility to resist the ego's demand to be right. And it requires courage to commit yourself to responsibilities that often feel heavy and relentless. But that is precisely why it works. Strength is not built through comfort or retaliation. It is built through the daily choice to shoulder responsibility, even when you don't feel like it. And so rising above is not passive. It is the most active thing you can do. You are choosing to elevate, to build, to create, rather than to tear down. You are choosing to direct your limited energy toward the construction of something worthy. And this, more than anything else, is what separates the strong from the weak, the mature from the immature, the noble from the petty. So when someone tries to drag you into the mud, remember, you cannot be both in the mud and on the mountain at the same time. You must choose, and the path of responsibility, though it is harder, always leads upward.